the 19th of December, 1944, near Bastogne, Belgium. A frozen field under a ceiling of gray clouds. 4 Sherman tanks crouched behind a ridge, their engines idling low, their hulls glazed with ice. 12 German Panzers were moving toward them through the fog, heavy, deliberate, unstoppable. Inside one of those Shermans sat Sergeant Frank Delaney, a 24-year-old loader from Chicago who had been a mechanic before the war. The air inside the tank smelled of oil and cordite. Every breath felt like breathing through steel. His commander, Lieutenant Harris, was shouting range calls through the intercom, voice cracking from static and fear. The first German round landed short. The next ripped into the ridge, throwing dirt and ice against the hull. Delaney's hands trembled as he grabbed a shell from the rack, 38 pounds of high-explosive steel. He followed the manual, faced the breach, nose forward, ram it in, step clear. But the cramped turret and frozen gloves made the move clumsy, slow. The Panzer guns reloaded faster. Another impact. Sparks rained from the turret wall. "We're sitting ducks," the gunner yelled. Delaney turned, saw the breach glowing faint red from heat, the floor slick with condensation. And then, somewhere between fear and instinct, something shifted. He remembered a conversation from training, an old mechanic joking that if a tank ever jammed on a slope, you could flip the loading stance to compensate for gravity. A stupid trick, the man had called it. Nobody tried it, nobody was supposed to. But right now, nothing about this fight made sense anyway. Delaney spun his body sideways, back toward the gun. He held the shell reversed, using his left hand to guide the base into the breach. The motion felt wrong, reckless, but it slid in smoother than before. "Loaded!" he shouted. The gunner fired. The recoil slammed the turret, but the shot struck true one. Panzer erupted in a column of smoke. No one spoke. Only the hiss of radio static and the sound of Delaney grabbing another shell. He did it again, backward, fast. 3 seconds. Loaded. Another shot. Another German tank gone. What began as a desperate accident was turning into something else. A rhythm. A system. Outside, the fog glowed orange with burning armor. Inside, the crew realized that the stupid trick might just keep them alive. The ridge outside Bastogne was more than just frozen ground. It was the last shield between the German armor and the supply road feeding the entire 101st Airborne Defense. If that line cracked, the town would be surrounded, and the men inside would freeze or starve before relief arrived. Lieutenant Harris understood that, and so did every man in his tank platoon. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and nearly out of shells, yet none of them moved. The air smelled like burnt powder and diesel smoke, the kind that sticks to your tongue and reminds you you're still alive. Delaney's ears rang from the last shot, his whole body trembling inside layers of wool and steel. The radio crackled with fragments of panic, another platoon calling for help, another Sherman already gone. Through the periscope, he could see the silhouettes of Panzers grinding forward in formation, each shot from their 75mm guns landing closer, shaking the snow loose from the trees. He reloaded again, using his strange reversed motion, while Harris tried to keep the gun aimed through the blinding fog. The Germans thought they had them pinned, but the backward-loading rhythm had cut their firing cycle almost in half. One shell after another left the barrel, vanishing into the smoke, striking with brutal precision that no one in the crew could fully explain. "It's working," the gunner muttered, disbelief mixing with adrenaline. "Keep loading like that." Delaney didn't answer. He couldn't afford to break the trance that had taken hold of him. Every second became a ritual grab, twist, shove, shout, fire, recoil, breathe. The motion was so unnatural it somehow fit the chaos perfectly. Outside, the fog had turned orange from the burning wrecks. Through the thin armor plates, they could feel the shock waves of explosions pounding the frozen ground. A shell screamed past, slicing through a Sherman on their left. The blast rocked them so hard that Harris slammed into the turret ring. "They've got us zeroed," he yelled, but his voice was drowned by the next explosion. Delaney grabbed another round without thinking, his gloves stiff with frost and sweat. The brass casing scorched his palm, but he didn't care. He slid it home backward again, shouted, "Up!" and felt the entire tank jerk as the gunner fired. Somewhere beyond the smoke, a Panzer erupted into fire, its turret lifting like a manhole cover blown skyward. The crew didn't cheer. They just stared, breathing hard, as if afraid the spell would break. For the first time that morning, the German line hesitated. Through the haze, black shapes turned, some reversing, others confused by the sudden disappearance of their lead tanks. "They think we're a whole unit," Harris said quietly. "They don't know it's just us." The Sherman's engine growled and idle, steam rising from the radiator vents, mixing with snowflakes that melted before touching the metal. The smell of ozone, grease, and death filled the confined air. In that strange stillness between explosions, Delaney realized the truth of their situation. No reinforcements were coming, no other tanks were left standing, and every remaining shell in their rack was all that stood between them and the end of the line. The stupid trick had bought them time, but time on a battlefield was only another kind of fuse. Harris adjusted his headset and whispered, "Keep going. As long as we're breathing, they don't cross this ridge." Delaney nodded silently, his back to the gun, fingers locked around another shell, ready to keep feeding the weapon that now felt more alive than any man inside. Each backward load was a rebellion, a refusal to die the proper way. And somewhere out there, in the white mist and burning steel, the Germans were learning that even a desperate mechanic's mistake could rewrite the rules of war. The next 5 minutes inside Delaney's Sherman were not minutes at all, but a blur of motion, noise, and fire compressed into something timeless and suffocating. The world outside had vanished behind a curtain of smoke, and the crew could see only the trembling glow of the periscope, reflecting each explosion like lightning trapped in glass. The tank shook with every recoil, every impact, every scream that bled through the static-filled radio, yet no one dared stop to think. They were operating on instinct now, a small crew locked inside an iron cage performing a ritual of survival. Delaney's hands had lost all feeling. The cold and vibration had numbed every nerve until they moved by memory alone. His reversed loading motion, awkward and absurd at first, had become muscle memory, a rhythm so fast that the others began to move in time with him, synchronizing their breathing with his pace. The commander called ranges, the gunner adjusted elevation, and the loader worked like a machine possessed. Outside, the Panzers were circling to flank, their engines growling low through the fog, metal tracks biting into frozen soil. Harris's voice cracked through the intercom, ordering the driver to pivot left, then right, to keep the frontal armor pointed toward the threat. A shell slammed into the ridge just above them, showering the hull with shards of rock that rattled like hail. The impact made the entire crew flinch, but Delaney did not hesitate. He rammed another shell backward into the breach, his shoulder pressing against the cold steel, his boots sliding in the spent casings that now carpeted the turret floor. "Up!" he shouted, and the gun fired again. The recoil drove the barrel back like a piston, slamming the air out of his lungs. Smoke filled the confined space. The ventilation fan whined weakly, struggling against the fumes of burnt powder. Through the periscope, the gunner caught a glimpse of one of the German tanks bursting into flames, its ammunition cooking off in a chain of orange flashes. "Hit confirmed," he whispered, almost in disbelief. The Germans were still advancing, but slower now, confused, the formation breaking as they tried to locate the unseen enemy. The sound of their engines grew erratic, some revving forward, others halting. Harris realized they were firing blind, shooting at ghosts. "They can't see us," he muttered. "We're in the fog pocket. They're killing their own line of sight." For the first time, Delaney understood the advantage his unorthodox method had created. Facing backward, the Sherman's barrel sat lower against the terrain, using the ridge itself as a natural shield. The Germans thought they were firing at an abandoned wreck, never realizing the cannon was angled just enough to strike through the fog. The stupid trick wasn't just faster, it made them invisible. He loaded again, slower now, his body aching, each movement dragging against fatigue. The gun fired, and somewhere out in the gray, another Panzer vanished from the fight. The tank interior reeked of burnt cordite and human sweat. The radio carried the voices of other crews calling for help, but no one answered anymore. Delaney tried not to listen. The war outside the hull no longer existed. There was only this confined universe of metal and breath. 4 men trying to cheat death one round at a time. Harris's eyes were red from exhaustion, his gloved hand trembling on the turret handle, yet his voice stayed steady. "Keep feeding her," he said. "As long as she's roaring, they don't move another inch." Another explosion ripped through the fog. Closer this time, shaking loose the spare shells stacked behind Delaney. He turned, shielding his face as brass clattered around his boots. His heart pounded so hard it blurred his vision. Then, through the ringing in his ears, he heard something new, the sound of German engines reversing, treads grinding backward through snow and mud. The enemy was pulling away. He glanced at Harris, who gave a tired grin, half relief, half disbelief. In that moment, Delaney realized the battle might not be won, but for the first time it wasn't lost either. The impossible had become routine, the absurd had become survival, and somewhere in that transformation lay the thin line between fear and mastery. The Sherman creaked, groaned, and then went silent for a heartbeat, only the wind outside filling the void. Inside the tank, no one spoke. They just breathed alive, stunned, and waiting for whatever would come next. When the smoke began to thin, Harris ordered the crew to hold fire and conserve ammunition, but no one moved to obey. The tank was too hot, the metal walls sweating from the heat of repeated firing, the air thick enough to chew. Delaney leaned against the breach, chest heaving, trying to steady his hands. Around him, the world was a storm of details, the hum of the generator, the groan of the turret ring, the distant echo of retreating engines fading through the fog. For the first time since dawn, the battlefield felt almost quiet, though the quiet carried a strange weight, the kind that presses on the chest instead of easing it. Outside the Sherman, the ridge was a cemetery of steel. Flames licked the hulls of Panzers that had once looked invincible, their silhouettes warped by heat. Snow melted into black pools that hissed where burning metal met frozen ground. The radio was still alive, crackling with half-broken words, fragments of orders, screams, coordinates, and static, but none of them applied to Harris's crew anymore. They were cut off, forgotten. A single tank that had done something no manual, no training course, no engineer had ever imagined. Inside, the silence of realization settled heavier than the noise of combat. Delaney finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "That's not how they taught us at Knox." Harris gave a low laugh that sounded more like exhaustion than humor. "They didn't teach us for this kind of war," he said. The manual on Sherman loading, printed in 1942, prescribed 4 precise steps for safety and consistency. Face the breach, align the shell, ram straight, step clear. It was the gospel of armored warfare, designed for predictable environments and obedient soldiers. But nothing about Bastogne was predictable. Snow jammed the hatches, radio lines failed, visibility shrank to nothing, and doctrine was just paper when steel started burning. Delaney thought of that as he looked at his blackened gloves, the fingertips scorched where brass casings had seared through the fabric. He remembered the lectures about safety margins, the drills that measured timing in neat, mathematical intervals. Those numbers didn't mean anything here. Out in this frozen valley, survival had rewritten the equations. The backward load had been born of panic, not planning, but it had worked because it broke the rhythm the enemy understood. The Panzers had expected American tanks to follow the same predictable cadence, 4 seconds to load, 2 to aim, 1 to fire. They could time their advances by it. Delaney's chaos destroyed that timing. Harris knew it too. "They read our habits," he muttered. "We just changed the script." His words hung in the air like smoke. None of the men wanted to admit it, but they all felt the same unease by surviving. They had broken something sacred. The army taught them that safety and discipline won battles, not luck or defiance. Yet in the end, defiance had done what discipline could not. It had saved them. As the minutes passed, snow began to fall again, soft and slow, muting the colors of destruction. The flakes hissed as they touched the heated barrel, turning instantly to steam. The landscape looked almost peaceful, as if pretending nothing had happened. Through the periscope, the gunner watched the horizon for movement but saw only smoke and falling snow. The war outside the ridge still raged, but for this small crew, time had stopped in a bubble of disbelief. Delaney sat down, his back against the turret wall, and stared at the stack of empty shell casings piled around his boots. They gleamed faintly in the low light, each one a testament to a rule broken and a life preserved. He thought about the men who had died following the manual, doing everything right. He thought about the absurdity of surviving by doing everything wrong. "You think they'll believe us?" he asked quietly. Harris shook his head, eyes still fixed on the horizon. "They'll call it luck," he said. "They always do, until someone writes it down." The wind outside shifted, carrying the faint rumble of artillery from miles away. The war was still out there, waiting. But inside the battered Sherman, something irreversible had already happened. A tiny rebellion had turned into revelation. Somewhere, far from this frozen ridge, engineers and instructors would keep teaching the same old drills, never knowing that in the smoke of Bastogne, one crew had rewritten the laws of their craft. And in that quiet moment, as snow covered the burning wrecks, Delaney realized that sometimes the only way to survive a war built on rules was to break every single one of them. As daylight struggled through the smoke, the ridge looked like another planet, ashen, cratered, and steaming from the heat of dying machines. The surviving Shermans stood half buried in snow, their armor scarred and blackened, their crews hollow-eyed and silent. Beyond the ridge, the valley was littered with the wrecks of German armor, each one twisted into grotesque shapes that no longer resembled tanks but monuments to a mistake. The fog of gunpowder had begun to clear, revealing what the radio reports would later call an inexplicable stand by an unidentified unit. No one had expected the line to hold, yet it had, and no one understood how. Harris climbed out of the turret first, his boots sinking into the slush that had been snow before the battle turned the ground to mud. His breath came out in ragged bursts, visible in the cold air, and for the first time in hours, he could see the sun through the haze, a pale disk hanging above a horizon of smoke. "We did it," the gunner whispered, still half in disbelief, as if saying it too loud might undo the miracle. But Harris didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the distance, where the last column of German armor had vanished into the woods. "They'll be back," he said finally, his voice low and flat. "They always come back." Inside the Sherman, Delaney remained seated, staring at the breach that had become both his weapon and his salvation. The paint around it was blistered from heat, the metal faintly warped, yet the mechanism still moved smoothly when he tested it with one bare hand. He thought of the exact moment when instinct had taken over, when he had turned his back to the gun and done the opposite of everything he had been taught. It wasn't brilliance, and it wasn't bravery. It was something simpler and more human, the refusal to die without trying something different. He wondered how many others had died because they couldn't imagine breaking a rule that didn't make sense anymore. The driver cracked open his hatch, coughing against the cold, and muttered that the transmission was shot. The engine had been idling for hours, fighting the cold, and fuel was low. They couldn't move even if they wanted to. Harris nodded without emotion and told him to shut it down. The silence that followed felt unnatural, like the earth itself had stopped breathing. No artillery, no radio chatter, no mechanical rhythm, only the wind moving through the trees and the crackle of fire consuming the wrecks below. The battle was over, at least for now, but the unease of survival lingered heavier than the fear of death ever had. Delaney climbed out through the commander's hatch and stood beside Harris on the ridge. From there, they could see everything: the wrecked Panzers, the burned earth, the faint trails of retreating enemy armor disappearing into the forest. "We should report it," Delaney said quietly, though even as he spoke, he knew it sounded absurd. How could you explain to a major or a colonel that a backwards loading trick had turned one Sherman into a phantom that destroyed 12 Panzers? How could you justify something that wasn't in the manual, something that sounded more like desperation than strategy? Harris smiled without looking at him. "We'll tell them the truth," he said, "and they'll write something else." Snow began to fall again, drifting over the wreckage, erasing the scars of battle one white layer at a time. In a few hours, the ridge would look untouched, the fire buried beneath ice, the story fading into rumor. Other units would move in, find the burned tanks, and call it a miracle or a fluke. But for Delaney and his crew, the memory would stay sharp: the smell of cordite, the heat of the gun, the impossible rhythm that had turned chaos into order. As he looked out over the valley, Delaney realized that their victory would never make sense in any report or history book. It would live only in the minds of those who had felt the recoil, the fear, and the sudden clarity that comes when instinct overrides logic. The rule book had burned with the morning fog, and in its ashes, 4 men had discovered something that manuals could never teach. They had become the ghost line, the impossible stand that no one planned, no one commanded, and no one could ever explain. By the time night fell again over Bastogne, the snow had hardened into glass, reflecting the dim light of distant flares that pulsed like heartbeats against the low clouds. The wind carried the muffled sound of artillery from somewhere far beyond the forest, a reminder that the war was still devouring men, even as this ridge lay in uneasy silence. The Sherman sat in the same position it had fought from, its barrel still pointed toward the valley, a monument of soot and frost. Inside, the crew huddled in their coats, listening to the creaks of cooling metal and the slow tick of the gun's recoil springs settling into place. It felt less like a victory than an accident that had somehow refused to die. Delaney stared at his hands, still black with grease and smoke, the skin around his knuckles cracked and raw. He tried to remember the sequence of those 6 minutes when 12 Panzers had vanished from the field, but the memory came in fragments, flashes of heat, the metallic taste of cordite, the sound of the gun slamming shut. He didn't feel like a hero. None of them did. The newspapers would never know their names, and the official report would reduce the chaos to a single line: enemy armor repelled after brief engagement. Harris read it aloud hours later when headquarters finally made contact, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Repelled," he repeated quietly, "like we pushed them back with discipline and doctrine instead of panic and luck." The others didn't argue. They were too tired to care about the language of war. the tidy words that erased what survival really looked like. The driver, slumped against the hull, muttered that maybe it was better that way. "They won't believe it anyway," he said, half asleep. "Who'd believe a tank fired backward and won?" The gunner chuckled weakly, but even his laughter sounded worn out. The truth was too strange to tell, and maybe too fragile to survive retelling. In the frozen quiet of that night, they all understood that some stories belonged only to those who lived them. Outside, the sky flickered again as German artillery probed the horizon, searching for targets that no longer existed. The ridge remained invisible under a veil of smoke and snow. Delaney climbed halfway out of the hatch, letting the cold air bite his face. The valley below looked unreal, as if painted in shades of gray and white, the shapes of destroyed Panzers blending with the terrain. The fires had died out, leaving only the faint hiss of cooling metal. He thought about the men inside those tanks, the same fear, the same training, the same belief in their machines, and wondered if any of them had seen what he saw in those last seconds, the barrel of a Sherman firing from the wrong direction. Harris joined him at the hatch, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "You think they'll study this?" he asked, his breath mixing with the smoke. "Maybe some engineer will call it a fluke of terrain or weather, something they can measure." Delaney shook his head. "They'll call it luck," he said, "or they'll forget it happened at all." The commander exhaled slowly, watching the smoke vanish into the wind. "Then maybe that's for the best," he said. "The rulebook keeps men alive most days. It's the one day it doesn't that no one wants to talk about." The two men stood there in silence for a long time, their words dissolving into the snow. The war still thundered in the distance, but on this ridge, it felt like something sacred had been spent and could never be recovered. They had seen the thin edge between survival and annihilation, the narrow space where instinct took over and logic stepped aside. The stupid trick, born from desperation, had turned into a weapon no strategist could design, and no soldier could repeat the same way twice. It wasn't a tactic, it was an accident of genius, a flash of defiance carved into the machinery of war. When Delaney finally climbed back inside, the interior smelled of rust and old smoke, the scent of something that had burned and endured. He sat down beside the gun, resting one hand on the cold steel, and realized that the machine felt alive in its own way, as if it remembered too. Outside, the snow began to fall again, covering the tracks, the wrecks, and the evidence of everything that had happened. By morning, the ridge would be just another line on a map, and the men who had held it would move on to another fight. But for now, they sat in the dark, surrounded by silence and memory, knowing that their impossible stand would live only in whispers, passed between soldiers who understood that sometimes the only rule worth following was the one you made when every other rule had failed. By dawn, the snow had stopped falling, and the ridge lay silent under a pale sheet of ice that shimmered faintly in the first light. The sky was the color of lead, and the world seemed drained of sound, as if the battle had stolen even the wind. Delaney was the first to move, crawling out of the hatch and into the frozen air. His breath formed small clouds that vanished instantly, leaving behind only the faint scent of burned oil and gunpowder that still hung in the mist. Below him stretched the valley, quiet and lifeless, dotted with the black carcasses of 12 Panzer tanks. They looked like enormous insects overturned on their backs, their treads twisted, their armor split open by heat. He climbed down from the Sherman, boots crunching in the snow, and began walking toward the nearest wreck. Each step felt heavy, not from exhaustion alone, but from the strange disbelief that this wasteland was real. Harris followed behind him, coat collar turned up against the cold, eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting another wave of armor to appear. But there was no movement, no engine noise, no enemy. The war, for now, had passed them by. The silence was almost unbearable. When they reached the first Panzer, its gun barrel pointed uselessly into the sky. Delaney stopped and stared at the ragged hole punched clean through its frontal armor. He could still smell the burnt metal, sharp and acrid, mixed with the faint sweetness of antifreeze leaking from its ruptured systems. "You did that," Harris said softly, though it sounded less like praise and more like confession. Delaney shook his head. "We did that," he answered. "Or maybe the tank did. Maybe it just got tired of dying the right way." The commander gave a dry laugh that echoed across the empty field and was swallowed by the fog. They spent the next hour checking the wrecks, counting them without speaking the numbers aloud. 12 destroyed Panzers, no survivors, no movement among the blackened hulls. The German column had been annihilated in less than 10 minutes, and the ground bore the scars to prove it deep gouges where shells had struck, black craters filled with slush and smoke. Delaney crouched beside one of the impacts and ran a glove through the snow, uncovering fragments of shrapnel. They were still warm to the touch. He turned the metal over in his palm and thought about the men inside those tanks, soldiers like him, following orders, trusting machines that had promised invincibility. As the sun rose higher, the snow reflected the light in sharp flashes that made it hard to look too long at the battlefield. The beauty of the morning felt wrong, like a lie told by nature to cover the truth. Harris radioed headquarters, reporting their position and the state of the line. The voice that replied sounded incredulous, asking for confirmation again and again, as if the words themselves couldn't be believed. 12 Panzers destroyed? The officer repeated. By one platoon? Harris hesitated before answering. By one tank, he said finally. One tank with one very stubborn crew. When they returned to the Sherman, the vehicle looked ancient, its olive paint scorched black, its side panels dented and streaked with soot. The barrel still glistened faintly from frost and heat residue. Delaney placed a hand on it, feeling the cold metal beneath his palm. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a secret, something too fragile to explain. Around them, the snow began to drift again, soft flakes settling over everything, erasing footprints, smoothing out the scars. Soon there would be no sign of the battle at all, only the memory carried by 4 men who had seen what no one else would believe. As they climbed back inside, Harris turned to Delaney and said quietly, "When they ask how we did it, just tell them the truth. Tell them it was stupid." Delaney smiled faintly, the exhaustion etched deep in his face. "It was," he said, "but it worked." The hatch closed with a metallic clang, sealing them once more inside the dim, smoky world that had become their home. Outside, the wind rose again, scattering snow across the ridge, covering the dead, the tanks, and the evidence of everything that had happened here. The war would move on, but somewhere in its endless machinery, this morning would linger a ghost of steel and defiance, a reminder that sometimes the impossible only needs one foolish act to become real. By the second day after the battle, word had already begun to spread through the American positions like a half-believed rumor. Men in other companies spoke of a single Sherman that had destroyed 12 Panzers in minutes, a phantom tank that appeared out of the fog, fired backward, and vanished again before anyone could confirm what had happened. Some said it was an ambush set by engineers using captured German guns. Others insisted it was divine intervention, a miracle born out of desperation and cold. No one mentioned the names of the men inside, because no one knew them. To the rest of the division, they were just the crew on the ridge, a myth wrapped in smoke. Delaney sat inside the Sherman, listening to the distant chatter on the radio as units tried to verify the story. Every retelling stretched the truth a little further. By evening, the number of destroyed tanks had become 14, then 16, each version adding another impossible detail. "They'll never believe what really happened," Harris said, leaning against the turret wall, eyes closed from exhaustion. "Maybe that's better," Delaney answered quietly. "The truth doesn't sound heroic anyway." He looked at his hands again, still marked with soot that wouldn't wash off, and realized that what he felt wasn't pride but disbelief, a hollow awareness that something unrepeatable had occurred and already slipped beyond their control. Later that night, an officer from headquarters arrived on a half-track, demanding a full report. His uniform was spotless, his tone clipped and professional, as if order could be restored through the right choice of words. Harris handed over the logbook, half filled with grease-stained notes, and explained the situation as plainly as he could. The officer frowned at the mention of the backward-loading technique, shaking his head slowly. "That's not standard procedure," he said. "You're telling me you violated protocol under combat conditions?" Harris nodded without hesitation. "Yes, sir. We did." The officer hesitated, then closed the notebook without writing anything. "Understood," he said quietly. "Let's just call it field improvisation." When he left, taking the logbook with him, Delaney watched the half-track vanish down the frozen road, its tracks cutting through the snow like scars. "You think they'll file that report?" he asked. Harris smiled faintly. "They'll file something," he said. "Probably a version where we followed every rule perfectly." The 2 men laughed, but the sound carried no joy, only the tired recognition that truth and paperwork rarely met on the same battlefield. The next morning, a supply convoy stopped near the ridge, bringing fuel and rations. Mechanics examined the Sherman, photographing the damaged armor and the scorched gun barrel, their faces showing the quiet awe of men looking at an artifact. One of them ran a gloved hand along the breech, noticing the slight scoring from the reversed motion. "Never seen loading marks like that," he murmured. Harris just nodded. "You won't again," he said. "Once was enough." The mechanics exchanged glances, but didn't ask questions. In war, strange things happened every day. But this was something different. As the crew refueled and rearmed, the fog began to lift completely, revealing the valley in stark daylight. The German dead had been cleared, the wrecks dragged aside, and the snow once again covered the ground in an almost innocent white. To anyone passing by, the ridge looked ordinary, a nameless rise in the Ardennes like thousands of others. But for those who had seen it under fire, it felt like sacred ground. Delaney took one last look before climbing back into the tank. He could still see faint black stains where the Panzers had burned, the ghosts of machines that had once seemed unstoppable. When they finally rolled out to rejoin their unit, the Sherman moved slowly, groaning under its own scars. The engine coughed, the treads squealed, and the smell of burnt oil clung to everything. But the machine still moved, stubborn and alive, carrying with it the memory of what had happened here. As the ridge faded behind them, Harris looked through the commander's periscope and said softly, "They'll tell this story wrong for the rest of their lives." Delaney didn't answer. He just stared at the horizon, where the smoke of another battle was already rising, and thought that maybe that was the point. Some truths didn't belong in reports or medals, they belonged in whispers, passed between soldiers who understood that survival sometimes comes not from doing things right, but from daring to do them wrong. The winter of 1944 dragged on like a wound that refused to close, and the snow never stopped falling long enough for the world to look alive again. The roads froze, cracked, thawed, and froze once more, until every journey felt like crossing glass that could shatter at any moment. The men of the 37th Tank Battalion lived inside their machines now, sleeping where they fought, wrapped in oil-stained blankets that smelled of cordite and diesel. For Delaney and his crew, every new dawn looked the same gray sky, white earth, and the dark silhouette of the Sherman moving forward into another patch of fog that might hold an ambush or nothing at all. They never spoke about the ridge anymore, not because they had forgotten it, but because the memory had settled too deeply to touch without breaking something inside. It had become a private talisman, a secret that felt both sacred and shameful. Each of them carried a fragment of it in silence. Harris with his clipped tone and careful reports that omitted what could not be explained, the gunner who still flinched whenever the breech slammed shut, the driver who refused to look out the periscope for too long, and Delaney, who could no longer load a shell the proper way without feeling the backward motion echo in his muscles like an old scar. Rumors of their miracle stand continued to circulate across the front, mutating with every retelling. In one version, an entire platoon of Shermans had turned the tide with flawless coordination. In another, an airstrike had mistaken the German column for retreating Allied armor and destroyed it by accident. Only a few mentioned the lone tank on the ridge, and even those who did spoke of it with the tone reserved for legends, not reports. The ghost line, some soldiers called it, as if the name could explain the unexplainable. Harris let the myth grow. He never corrected it. "Let them have their story," he told Delaney once, his voice low over the engine's rumble. "Truth dies quicker than rumor out here." Days blurred into weeks, and the war ground forward through Belgium and into Germany, one frozen town after another. The Sherman that had survived the ridge limped along with the rest, patched together with welded armor plates and scavenged parts. Every dent, every burn mark became a kind of history written in metal. The men joked that the tank was haunted, that it refused to die because it still had something left to prove. Delaney never laughed at those jokes. He knew there was something of truth in them. Machines remember, in their own way, through the scratches and heat marks left by human hands. One night, when the battalion bivouacked outside a ruined village, Delaney stood watch beside the tank while the others slept. The air smelled faintly of smoke and pine, the snow reflecting the glow of distant fires from the front. He looked up at the stars, pale and sharp in the frozen sky, and felt the strange stillness that always followed survival. The world had gone quiet again, but he knew it was only waiting for the next round of thunder. Somewhere out there, new crews were learning the same lessons, repeating the same mistakes, and inventing their own desperate miracles. The rulebook would always be rewritten by men who didn't live long enough to explain how. When Harris joined him, the commander's face looked older, the lines around his eyes deepened by fatigue. He handed Delaney a tin cup of coffee gone cold and said, "They're talking about sending us home after this push." Stateside. Delaney nodded but said nothing. Home sounded like a story from another life. Harris watched him for a long moment, then added, "What we did, it mattered, even if no one writes it down." Delaney smiled faintly and looked back at the Sherman, its surface glinting under the moonlight like old bone. "It mattered to her," he said. "That's enough." They stood there in silence as the wind swept across the fields, carrying with it the distant echoes of artillery and the smell of iron and smoke. The war was still raging somewhere beyond their reach, but for that brief night, the front felt suspended in time, balanced between memory and myth. The ridge, the fog, the impossible victory, all of it seemed to belong to another world now, one that existed only in whispers. And as the snow began to fall again, soft and unending, Delaney realized that what they had done was no longer theirs alone. It had already passed into legend, carried on the breath of men who needed to believe that somewhere, somehow, courage and foolishness could be the same thing. When the war finally ended, the world did not erupt in the fireworks of memory or the clean triumph of victory posters. It simply went quiet, as if the earth itself exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The guns stopped, the engines cooled, and the great noise that had swallowed Europe for 6 years faded into wind and rain. For men like Delaney, silence was harder to live with than sound. After months of thunder, the absence of it left a hollow space inside his chest, something too deep to fill with words. He came home to Chicago in the spring of 1946, carrying a duffel bag that smelled of oil and rust, and dreams that kept replaying in the rhythm of the gun's recoil. The newspapers back home printed stories of victory parades, generals in open cars, and ticker tape fluttering between skyscrapers. But for the men who came back from the Ardennes, celebration felt like a language they no longer spoke. Delaney found work in a repair shop near the stockyards, fixing tractors and delivery trucks, the familiar hum of machinery replacing the voices he didn't want to hear. Every time he touched a wrench, he felt the weight of that moment on the ridge, 12 German tanks burning in the snow, the gun smoke curling like ghosts around the barrel. He never spoke about it, not to his family, not to the other veterans. When people asked what he did in the war, he said he fixed things, and left it there. Years passed, and the Sherman that had carried them through hell was shipped back to the States, stripped of its weapons, and placed in a scrapyard outside Detroit. It sat there for almost a decade, rusting quietly among hundreds of others, its scars fading under layers of dust and rain. Then one day, a group of engineers from the Army Ordnance Department came to inspect the old tanks for parts. They stopped at Delaney's Sherman, noting the unusual scoring on the breech and the odd modifications around the loading system. Someone remarked that the wear pattern didn't match the manuals. Another called it an improvised tension method. They photographed it, wrote a short report, and moved on, never realizing that they were touching the bones of a miracle. In the 1,950 seconds, those same engineers designed a new loading mechanism for the M48 Patton tank, a system that allowed faster shell alignment and reduced the risk of misfire under stress. The concept was filed as a technical improvement, based on field observations from European combat units. No one mentioned the ridge near Bastogne, or the 4 men who had rewritten physics with instinct and desperation. History remembered the innovation, but not the invention. The world moved forward, cleaner, faster, more efficient. Delaney never knew that his backwards loading motion had survived in steel. He lived a quiet life, fixing engines, raising 2 children, drinking coffee on his porch while listening to the trains at night. Sometimes, when a wrench slipped and the metal rang out in a high, sharp tone, he would close his eyes and see the flash of that morning again. The fog, the smoke, the impossible stillness after the last shot. It came back not as glory, but as gravity, a pull towards something he could never quite explain. When he died in 1971, a fellow tanker from his unit placed a single spent shell casing on his grave, polished to a dull shine. No inscription, no medals, no speeches, just a fragment of the machine that had outlived them all. Decades later, tourists would walk past the rebuilt Sherman, displayed in a military museum, tracing fingers over its cold armor and reading the plaque beneath it. The words were simple: unidentified crew, Bastogne, 1,944. 12 enemy tanks destroyed. No mention of the trick, no note of how it had been done, just the fact that it had happened. And maybe that was how it should be. Legends don't belong to the men who make them. They belong to the silence that follows, to the space between what was possible and what should never have worked. On that frozen ridge, 4 ordinary men had bent the rules of war until they broke, and somehow survived the breaking. In doing so, they left behind a truth bigger than their names, that every machine carries a memory, and every act of madness, if it saves a life, becomes another way for the world to move forward. It was nearly 30 years after Bastogne, when a young ordnance engineer named Thomas Keegan stumbled across a forgotten file in the Army archives. A thick folder filled with faded photographs and typed reports from the winter of 1944. He had been researching the evolution of tank control systems for a technical journal, tracing how small design flaws in wartime machinery often became the seeds of later innovation. Inside that file, he found a series of maintenance notes attached to an anonymous Sherman, the kind of field reports that most historians ignored. One line caught his eye. Non-standard tension adjustment applied to aileron-style loading cable improved performance under extreme cold. There was no name, no explanation, only a cryptic reference to reverse cycle firing tests, and a blurred image of a gun breech with scorch marks in the wrong direction. Keegan was curious. He ordered the physical record from storage, spending hours in a dim reading room surrounded by the smell of dust and carbon paper. The photos showed a Sherman half buried in snow, its barrel blackened, and the words Bastogne sector, December 1944, scrawled on the back in pencil. The accompanying report mentioned 12 confirmed enemy tank kills and referred to an undocumented crew using unconventional loading procedures. The tone of the report was cautious, almost embarrassed, as if the writer had witnessed something he couldn't fully justify to his superiors. Keegan read the sentences again and again, feeling that strange pull familiar to anyone who senses a story buried under the surface of data. He began tracing the serial number of the tank, following the paper trail through decades of logistics records. It led him to a scrapyard in Michigan, then to a restored Sherman, displayed at the Army Ordnance Museum under a different identification code. When he visited the exhibit, he ran his hand over the armor and noticed the faint grooves near the gun breech, the same ones visible in the old photographs. He realized he was touching the machine that had defied every tactical model of its time. The museum placard offered only the sanitized summary, 12 Panzers destroyed, unidentified crew, but standing there, Keegan felt the echo of the human hands that had made that possible. The grooves were not just wear marks, they were fingerprints. Back at his office, he wrote a research paper about mechanical improvisation in battlefield conditions, focusing on how human intuition often preceded formal engineering design. He cited the Bastogne tank as an unnamed case study, describing how a field modification introduced by a non-commissioned officer produced an unexpected leap in operational efficiency. The article was published in a small military engineering review and quickly forgotten outside professional circles, yet within that narrow world, it sparked quiet fascination. Some called it apocryphal, others poetic. One reviewer even suggested that the reverse loading hypothesis was nothing more than a myth invented by soldiers who needed to make sense of chaos. Keegan didn't argue. He had seen the marks himself, and that was enough. Months later, he received a letter from an aging mechanic in Illinois who had read the article. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. "I think I knew the man who did that," it said. Name was Delaney, worked on engines his whole life. Said once that the war taught him machines could think if you listened close enough. There was no address, no signature, just those words and a folded photograph of a young man standing beside a Sherman, smiling awkwardly at the camera. The edges were worn, and the ink was fading, but the face was still clear, calm, ordinary, alive. Keegan pinned the picture above his desk and never mentioned it to anyone. In time, the Bastogne file was digitized and buried within the endless catalog of post-war data, its physical copies destroyed during a records consolidation. But every few years, Keegan revisited that old paper, rereading the dry technical language and remembering the moment his fingers had traced those grooves in the steel. It reminded him that behind every schematic and calculation lay the heartbeat of someone who once had no choice but to invent their own way to survive. Machines were designed by logic, but they were redeemed by instinct. The men who built them might vanish, their names forgotten, yet their touch lingered in the metal, whispering across decades to those still willing to listen. Years later, long after Keegan's small paper had drifted into obscurity, a curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History stumbled upon his article while cataloging post-war engineering archives. She was preparing an exhibit on the human element in wartime innovation, and the phrase reverse loading hypothesis caught her attention like a whisper from a forgotten century. There was no video, no living witness, just the fragments, reports, blueprints, and a single blurred photograph of a Sherman surrounded by snow and smoke. The image was grainy but haunting. It showed the tank facing the wrong direction, its gun angled down a slope, the smoke curling backward, as if time itself were reversing. It didn't look like victory. It looked like defiance frozen in motion. She added the story to the exhibit under the modest title Field Improvisation, the Bastogne Incident. The description was short, almost clinical. During the Battle of the Bulge, an American tank crew employed an unorthodox loading method to counter mechanical limitations under extreme conditions. Their actions resulted in the destruction of multiple enemy vehicles. Crew unidentified. Visitors passed by without slowing, their eyes drawn instead to the bigger artifacts. The uniforms, the medals, the restored fighter planes hanging from the ceiling. Yet sometimes, when the light hit the photograph just right, someone would pause, frown, and lean closer, trying to understand how a mistake could become salvation. On quiet evenings, when the museum closed and the halls filled only with the hum of air vents and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights, the curator would stand in front of that display and think about what it meant. She had never fought a war, never felt the heat of a gun barrel or the vibration of a tank track under fire. But she understood creation, the kind that came from pressure, fear, and necessity. In that dim photograph, she saw not heroism but ingenuity, not arrogance but humility before chaos. The story of the stupid trick had become something larger than the men who lived it. It had become a mirror for the simple truth that war, at its core, was not about destruction, but about survival shaped by imagination. Outside the museum, the city moved on, full of noise and neon, and people who would never know that a forgotten act of desperation still echoed in the steel around them. Yet in classrooms, in workshops, in the quiet minds of those who built things for a living, the spirit of that moment endured. Every time an engineer ignored a rule to make something work better, every time a mechanic trusted instinct over instruction, a faint echo of that ridge in Bastogne lived again. The legacy of Delaney's stupid trick had never been the number of tanks destroyed. It was the permission it granted to think differently when everything else failed. One afternoon, decades later, a boy visiting the museum stopped in front of the display with his father, staring at the photograph for a long time. "Why is the tank backwards?" he asked. The father read the caption, frowned, and said, "Maybe they had no other choice." The boy nodded, as if that were answer enough, and moved on. The curator watched from a distance, smiling softly. Maybe that was all history ever needed to make someone pause, to make them wonder. And somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the exhibits and the plaques, the wind still moved across the Ardennes, whispering through forests that had long since regrown over the scars of war. Beneath the soil, rusting fragments of armor slept quietly, their surfaces etched with the fingerprints of men who had refused to die by the book. The snow that once buried their machine now covered their story, layer upon layer, until only the faint hum of memory remained. But if you stood there long enough, in the stillness of that ridge, you might feel it, the echo of a tank facing the wrong way, the heartbeat of a crew who chose to fight on their own terms, and the eternal truth that sometimes the line between foolishness and genius is drawn not by reason, but by survival itself.